Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled Acquiring and Accessioning Archival Materials. Let's begin with the definition. Acquisition establishes physical, legal, and intellectual control over the collection, whereas accessioning is the technique and system that archivists use to track the acquired collection and move it into the processing, arranging, and describing workflow. As we just established, acquisition has three component parts. Physical control requires the archives to actually take custody, to actually possess the records, manuscripts, and other archival materials. Acquisition does not occur until the materials change hands. Legal control means that the ownership and the title changes hands, except in cases of transfer or deposit, which we'll discuss in a moment. There's one caveat here. You must be careful to ensure that the donor has the legal right and ability to transfer the title. The mechanism to transfer ownership is usually the gift agreement, also called the donor agreement or the deed of gift. This document, which we'll discuss at length in a moment, is a legally binding contract that not only transfers ownership but also clarifies the rights of the original owner, clarifies the rights and responsibilities of the repository, and negotiates those shoals of copyright and any access or use restrictions. The last component of acquisition is the gathering or establishing intellectual control by gathering information to understand the collection, its contents, and the circumstances of its creation. The end result is a well-understood collection that the archivist can describe to provide high-level access to researchers. Information gathering and intellectual control begins prior to acquisition, but since this is usually the step where archivists first get to paw through the materials, intellectual control and information gathering accelerate during acquisition. Gregory Hunter, in your textbook, explains that there are four methods of acquiring collections. One of these is transfer, which he calls the systems method. This occurs when the archives is in-house, that is, it's within an agency, and ownership of the archival materials does not change hands. Transfer authority is an administrative procedure governed by a document called a records schedule or a records disposal authority. The second mechanism for acquiring collections is purchase. Purchase is straightforward. You buy a collection from a dealer. Archives sometimes do this to supplement their collections, usually of memorabilia or small private collections that have intrinsic monetary value. Things like Civil War letters, for example. Deposit is the temporary housing of a collection within an archival agency. Archivists usually frown upon this as it makes them liable for protecting a collection without empowering them to manage it as they see fit. Some collections cannot be donated but should still be kept in an archives on deposit. The most obvious example is a body of records from a state government agency. That body of records cannot be given away, but the state itself might not take custody. Let me give you an example. The archives of the Historic Chattahoochee Commission, a state agency of both Alabama and Georgia, reside on deposit here at the Wiregrass Archives. Wiregrass Archives is the official repository for the Historic Chattahoochee Commission, and we stand in for the Alabama Department of Archives and History, the Alabama State Archives. The Wiregrass Archives is in the Historic Chattahoochee Commission service area, and the Government Records Division of the Alabama Department of Archives and History has approved the Wiregrass Archives to be a repository for state and local governmental records on deposit. The last and most common acquisition method is called donation, or what Hunter calls the solicitation method. It is the transfer of custody and ownership without financial consideration. It is a gift that has certain necessary characteristics. Again, the donor must have the right and ability to give the gift. There must be a clear offer and an equally clear acceptance, and there must be transfer of the materials. Let's look at acquisition mechanics, particularly for donations. There's a document that every archives has or should have that controls what materials should come into the repository. This document is called the collecting policy. I considered putting in a section about the collecting policy into the lecture on appraisal, because the collecting policy is the thing that establishes the value of a collection to the repository. But I thought it would work better in acquisition, because acquisition is the step of applying the theories that you learned in appraisal. The collecting policy itself is a written statement that defines the scope of a repository's collecting activities. It establishes the collecting areas and the goals. It establishes what functions in the community or the institution are to be documented. A collecting policy must strike an appropriate balance between the goals of the repository and necessary flexibility. It's also a logical statement that looks at local research strengths and extends them, that anticipates future research interests, that supports published holdings in the collection of the archives or the library that the archives is attached to. It also states what types of collections we seek that have high research value, and the collecting policy ensures as little competition with other local repositories as possible. When archivists appraise for selection, they evaluate collections against this collecting policy. One component of acquisition is collection development. There are 6 stages of collection development that lead to acquisitions. Not all archivists will spend any appreciable time developing collections, but even so, it's a good thing for all archivists to understand how collection development works. Some of these practical steps relate specifically to how archivists conduct the tasks of acquiring. The first of these 6 stages is gathering data. This is part of the hunt for collections to acquire. You're looking for more than just old stuff. Remember, what occurs today is history tomorrow. When you find collections that you want to consider for intake, gather data about the function that they document, the creator, and the records themselves. You can do this from afar, or while you're having contact with the creator or the donor, and while you're dealing with the records themselves. And remember, gathering data is part of appraisal and part of selection and acquisition. So remember that the thing that establishes what you're looking for is the collecting policy document. A second step is preliminary contact with potential donors. Often, private donors find it difficult to let go of a collection. They suddenly feel nostalgic or have not seriously contemplating giving the materials away, or they think that your interest signals that their collection has a monetary value. This means that you probably have to spend a pretty good deal of time with a potential donor developing their collection and developing their ability to donate their collection. On the other hand, sometimes a donation happens quickly, so you have to be prepared to deal with the donation and either accept it or reject it, or accept part of it, or put in some stalling tactics so you can make a slower decision on your end. The third step in developing collections is preliminary appraisal. When you see a collection that you want to gather in, you appraise the function that the records document. Is it a function that should be documented in archives? What does your collecting policy say? Remember, you also appraise the creator. Did the creator create a satisfactory body of papers and records for acquisition? Did the creator have the ability to create records of enduring value? You also appraise the intellectual quality and physical condition of the records. Do they adequately document what you seek to document? Are they in good enough condition to acquire? Step 4 is donor negotiations. This is like any other property transfer. You cannot offer them monetary appraisal for tax purposes, though they can take this off their taxes. You can't offer them a monetary appraisal because that's both against IRS regulations and it's an ethical lapse because it creates a conflict of interest. You can point them to other appraisers who can give them a monetary value, but you cannot do the thing yourself. Step 5 is transport and receiving. You must arrange for transport and receiving. Sometimes you'll go fetch a collection. Sometimes they'll volunteer to bring a collection in, but you have to help arrange that. Sometimes you have to pay to have a collection moved. Sometimes they're willing to pay to have a collection moved. Don't leave things to chance. Get an expressed agreement about how and when transfer is to occur, and then hold up your end when you are developing collections. Last is the follow-up. Donor relations don't end with the receipt of the gift. Acknowledge the donor with a thank you letter. Mention that donor in a newsletter, website, Facebook, and other kinds of social media if you have their permission to do so. Continue to cultivate your past donors. They will either find more material to give you, or they will have access to other similar people in the community who may also be good fonts for collection development. Now, as I said earlier, the mechanism by which you acquire collections in the donation method is the gift agreement. The gift agreement is a legally binding contract between the donor and the repository. It establishes legal control over the materials. It also answers some questions. For example, it tries to deal with how the donor relates to the creator. This goes to the question of provenance, which we've not talked about yet. But it also answers the question, does the donor have the legal right to transfer copyright and the physical property? The gift agreement addresses who the recipient is, that is, your repository. Is your repository subject to the will of another entity? If so, what are the rights of that entity and what are the rights of your repository, as well as what are the rights of the donor? Another part of the gift agreement is the date of the title transfer. A description of what materials are conveyed is also a component. Next, a gift agreement addresses copyright. Who holds that copyright? And remember that the donor might not have the right to transfer copyright. Let me give you a case in point. Letters that a donor has received. The recipient, who is probably your donor, has no copyright in those letters written by other people to him or her. Copyright law says that whomever fixed the words to a permanent medium holds the original copyright. This, of course, does not apply to recordings made surreptitiously. What I'm saying here is that a donor may give all of his or her correspondence to you, but most of that correspondence, especially in much older collections, are not copies of letters that they wrote and sent out or their ancestor wrote and sent out. It's letters received by that person. The person who wrote the letters and their heirs and assigns hold the copyright. So does that negate your possession of this collection because donor X could not speak for Mr. or Ms. Y who wrote the letter that donor X is giving? No, what it does is make a little bit problematic your ability to publish these letters on the web or in a book or something like that. You have to make a good faith effort to track down the copyright holder, and copyright law is not so rigid, particularly because there's so little money involved in archival collections, that it gives you a real serious problem if you've made a good faith effort yet failed to locate any of these actual holders of copyright. Copyright law also allows the expiration of copyright after a number of years. Nevertheless, you should be aware of this kind of problem, particularly in transfer of copyright. Just because somebody gives you something doesn't mean that they have the right to transfer a copyright, and so you shouldn't necessarily believe that everything you've received is now your copyright. This gets a little complicated, and we can discuss this at a future date. Another component of the gift agreement are any restrictions. What are the restrictions? Are they restrictions on access or restrictions on use? Who can impose these restrictions is something the gift agreement usually deals with. To whom do these restrictions apply? And who can bypass or lift them or give permission for access or use? Another aspect of gift agreement is who has the disposal authority. How does disposition work? What about current or future deaccessioning? That is, if there are materials that you have accepted and that are covered by the donor agreement, what happens if you decide during processing that you don't really want to bring those things into your repository? What do you do with them? My gift agreement, in fact the one that you have in your hand, says that we, the archives, will contact the donor and offer the material back. The donor then has the right to either accept the material or to ask us to discard the material. Sometimes discarding simply means throwing away. Sometimes it means shredding. Sometimes it means finding another repository or another library to give the materials to. Who has the right to do that? That's covered in the gift agreement. Also, subsequent gifts should be covered in a gift agreement. A deed of gift usually applies to all future gifts from that same donor, but make sure you have some kind of language in the deed about future gifts. Let's talk now about what you do to accession collections. Accessioning implements acquiring the collection. It establishes physical and intellectual control. Accessioning are the systems used to track the acquisition of a collection and to move it into the repository's workflow so that it gets processed, arranged, described, and made available for research. Usually it's governed by a number of forms. A packet of forms should begin to develop at this point. The packet should include all the field notes and the preliminary appraisal documents that have been made by the collection development archivist or by you if you're developing the collection. The gift agreement should be in there. And most important is the Accession Log or the Accession Form. This records the receipt of the collection into the repository's processing scheme. It begins intellectual control over the collection by being a place that can record distilled information about the collection. There are some elements of the Accession Form that we'll look at in the next slide. One are collection identifiers. Another are collection descriptors. A third is administrative information, and a fourth is tracking or miscellaneous information. Let's look now at an accession form. This is a Microsoft Access database accession form that my repository has been using since 2002. This is the accession form for the very first record group and very first accession that we brought in. You can see that we have collection identifiers, the record group number, the accession number, and the record group name. We also have collection descriptors. That is the temporary size of the accession, the date span of the accession, the preliminary scope and content note of the accession. And you can't see it on this form because we keep it on a related database. There is a preliminary historical, biographical, or organizational sketch. We have here also administrative information, the date received, the name and the contact information for the donor, which you see at the bottom, and the donor's relationship to the collection. Finally, we have tracking and miscellaneous info. One at the top here is the temporary location of the unprocessed collection. The second is the preliminary processing plan, and the third are notes about the collection. Not all of this thing is filled out as thoroughly as it will be or would be. This was a collection that didn't have much in it, and so we were able to get finished with it fairly quickly. This then concludes this lecture, and as usual, I thank you for your attention.